On.
Hi.
We're back.
We're back.
And you're out of frame again. I'm going to put you in frame.
Let's do this.
You're good. So this is like our 6th week doing a live podcast on the Today's Mama Facebook page. I'm here for those of you who might be tuning in live for the very first time. My name is Nate Bagley. I'm the host of the Loveumentary, and this is my co-host for this season. Her name is Kristin Hodson. She's an ASEC certified sex therapist and a licensed clinical social worker.
There you go.
Every week I butcher it. Every week. Maybe by week 10 I will have things ironed out. But we had a couple of weeks talking about some really important things. How to talk about sex. We've talked about why your desire changes after you have a baby. We've talked about
lube.
That lube episode was mind-blowing. I got more letters from people about learning like that the FDA doesn't control or have any regulations against lube like that.
I think for a lot of people that episode, they were really surprised that there's so much more to learn about lube than just the simple basics.
Yep. So this week I'm really excited and kind of nervous.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about a topic that I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And the topic is fantasies.
Fantasies.
So I think that I'm glad we're talking about this because I think a lot of people need to get better at talking about their fantasies. Because talking about your fantasies is scary.
It's super scary.
I think people get scared. They think like, is my fantasy weird? What if I'm the only person who has this fantasy? What if I don't want to act it out?
Like you just want to share it, but you don't want to act on it.
Or what if what if my partner tells me their fantasy and I don't want to act it out and they do?
Yep.
Or like, what if our fantasy completely ruins our relationship and we can never take it back? Or what if like the fantasy that my partner shares with me makes me really uncomfortable and I don't feel good, like when I hear it? And so there's all this fear around why would I share this thing in my head that I might even be ashamed of for having. I think what is it, like 1 in 4 people feel guilty about the fantasies that they have.
Yeah, like that they'll judge them because it conflicts with their values and their morals.
So there's all this emotion and all this junk wrapped up around sexual fantasy. So I'm excited for you to help us navigate kind of this touchy terrain because I think it's important to have a fulfilling sex life to understand how fantasy can be incorporated.
Yeah.
So I think a good place to start might be, can you kind of define what a fantasy is?
Yeah. Yes. Because one of the things I talk about is I work with a lot of clients who will say, I'll ask them what are their sexual fantasies? And they'll say, I don't have one, because what they're assuming a sexual fantasy is may or may not be, but a sexual fantasy is something that is just a mental image picture that kind of gets sexual stirrings, because I know some people associate fantasy that it means a sexual act or behavior, but not necessarily. And particularly like to the Today's Mama crowd, there can be fantasies of increased sharing the chores.
Yeah, we talked about chore play 2 times ago.
Yeah. Or
no, it was last time we talked about foreplay, core play, and chore play.
Like having someone initiate doing the dishes, and you're like, that really makes me feel connected to you and super hot. And so once we start to reframe and broaden the idea,
so your fantasy can be like doing dishes?
It can be, because I know that when I'm exhausted and tired after a baby, my fantasy may or may not be something sexual, but actually if they're willing to, if we can partner better with the chores and the jobs of what's going around, that fantasy, if I can share that, actually connects me and can lead to a more intimate erotic experience with my husband.
Got it.
Right.
So a fantasy doesn't have to be something like super kinky or taboo or like.
I would say let's put fantasy on the spectrum, because you can totally have kinky and what would be like naughty fantasies and all these things. You're like, I shouldn't be thinking about this, to I just want someone to come in and someone take out the trash. And that can be the hottest fantasy you have.
Or I just want my husband to come home from work and pin me against the wall and kiss me and then tell me to go lay down and he'll take care of dinner tonight.
And I want my partner to come dressed up as the naughty librarian. Like that's the librarian.
Also a fantasy.
That's right. There's a ton, but it's kind of that. If you think of when we're kids, we're always imagining, like we come up with these scenarios. Kids are really good at exercising their imagination, sharing their imagination, making up games. And fantasies start oftentimes around age 12, 13, 14, like in the adolescent period where they start to move to more sexual, erotic fantasies.
Okay.
But it's still a form of play. it's still very much a form of play and sexual play, and a new a way that we can play with our partner.
So I think maybe the reason that we kind of step away from it, do you think, is because we assign some sort of morality to it? Or
I think we can judge our fantasies, and I mean,
because like you don't judge a kid for playing cops and robbers.
No, you know, or games that don't even make sense, where
Right.
you're like, you're gonna play that game doesn't even make sense. We
Right.
don't do that, but somewhere with sexual and erotic fantasies, we do, whether we do it to ourselves or we have been judged when we've shared something we want to do and someone gets grossed out. Emily Nagoski talks about yucking someone else's yum.
Yes, I love that.
That if your yum or what you're into, if you've shared that and you've been rejected or hurt or it's been exploited, that can make you less likely. Or if you haven't ever shared, that's really vulnerable. So
there you go.
all of
Don't
that.
yuck somebody else's yum.
Don't yuck someone else's yum.
That's
And
a
just
good takeaway.
understanding what I also see is people have fantasy, but they haven't necessarily connected it as their fantasy. Like what we talked about in other episodes about desire. Sometimes there can be a disconnect between desire because we're only seeing it in this really narrow lens and narrow way.
Got it. So take me through, I'm assuming there are like different types of fantasy.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through
Well,
some of
so
those different types?
yeah, because we kind of talked about some,
Right.
and I'm going to look
Like
at
you
our
mentioned the naughty librarian.
yes.
That's kind of like the forbidden imagery, like the novelty
yes.
kind of.
So you have there was a researcher, I mean, it's not limited to all of these, but you have the forbidden, the naughtiness, we shouldn't be doing this.
Mhm.
You have people making out in their parents' bedroom and they're like, ooh.
Right.
And, you know, like you have all this role play. That's where role play
Right.
can come in, and it can be really, really fun, but that's a hot fantasy. And oftentimes when we share a fantasy, when it's forbidden,
Mhm.
we try out our initial, like our safest one to see how our partner responds. Like we fill out the waters.
Right.
And
Start with something simple.
yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And that can be a safe way to just start getting skilled at talking about it, to listening to it, to getting curious about it. It's not even acting on it that's the most important piece. And we'll get to that, I think.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to derail from the types of fantasy.
No, you're good.
But
I think we'll get there too.
just talking about it, even people can live off of the energy of a fantasy for years without ever acting on it.
Interesting. How does that work?
Because if you start, so the big thing to know is the brain is the biggest sex organ. And so when you are stimulating the brain, we often talk about stimulating the genitals, but when we're stimulating the brain and we're starting to share, and especially when we're sharing fantasies, it starts to get you turned on and it starts to get you aroused. And if you're sharing it in a situation where you can't act on it, then it can
It builds up
even,
tension.
I
I got
all
you.
of that.
Cool.
Yeah. So I'm going to look at our show notes because then you have the scenes of sexual irresistibility.
So we talked about the novel of forbidden.
Yeah.
And number 2 of the types of fantasy is scenes of sexual irresistibility.
Right.
What's that?
Where I can seduce or be seduced, to where the art of seduction is so strong that it cannot be resisted.
So like you want me so bad that you just can't control it.
So bad. And, or to be ravished, to just.
Not ravaged.
Right.
Ravished.
Yes. Ravished. Thank you. I said that right.
Yeah, you got it right.
Okay. I was like, wait, did
right.
did I say it wrong once before?
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. But that's where just have it, and there can be some fun play where you just want to seduce and seduce and seduce, but you don't actually go there. Like there's that teasing component, kind of, there's a term called edging, but getting it there to almost to the point where a person can be begging, or, you know, that whole piece.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one is dominance or submission. And submission.
So this one's important because if we talk about fantasy on the bigger scale, look at how the Twilight series took over the country. Like it was the most popular book, and people were reading it everywhere.
And then you've got the Twilight fan fiction.
Well, yeah, so
which is 50
Shades of Grey.
Yeah.
That's what I thought was so fantasy. What I thought was so fascinating was that 50 Shades was off of Twilight. It's the kinky version of Twilight.
Yeah.
And that's erotic, that's fantasy. And you have that the sub-dom, the power play, the power dynamic. And there's a lot of women who want to be able to go into the bedroom and not have to be in charge. They can relinquish control. They can submit, and they're not having, because stereotypically women are having to manage and be in charge of a lot of aspects of their life, and they don't want to necessarily in their sex life.
Got it.
They want to rest. And hi, Lysandra. Saying hello.
So that makes sense. Those 3 categories make sense. And now I kind of want to segue, now that we understand what those categories are, why it's important to incorporate fantasy into your sex life. Because I think a lot of people think that they don't need fantasy if they have, like, what's the point of having, if I have an adequate sex life, what's the point of having fantasy? A fantasy is only used to, like, skirt around problems, or because maybe your sex life is lacking in some way, so you need fantasy to, like, supercharge it or get it out of a rut. Or
and I also want to add to that people can get really scared or threatened by someone else's fantasy. That if we're in the bedroom, that the sole focus should be on me, and if there is a fantasy that hasn't been shared, or if I'm fantasizing in the midst of a sexual experience, then our sex must be wrong. Something's wrong with you, something's wrong with me. And fantasy is not that way. Again, it's just sexual play of the brain. But people can get into these ruts where sex gets just super predictable. And while that's comfortable, where it's like, okay, first we're going to kiss, and then I'm going to touch your boobs, and then we go down each other's pants, and then we take off our clothes,
right,
and then we have intercourse or not, and we orgasm, the end. While that's comfortable and predictable, people oftentimes get pretty bored with that scenario. Bored. And so fantasy...
That seems like a pretty typical pattern.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
A natural progression of things.
And so there's a piece to how, like, knowing someone's inner erotic world, that's exciting and vulnerable. It's risky. And when we think about that stage of life where we were dating at the very beginning, it's filled with risk and uncertainty and not knowing, and this interplay between, ooh, I want to know more, and what's going to happen, anticipation, and actually a lot of fantasy.
Yeah.
Of where this relationship can go. What are we going to possibly do tonight? How far can we, like, where are we going to take this?
Right. And because there's a lot of fantasy, because there's a lot of mystery.
Yes.
There's a lot of unknowns. And so there's a lot of area for your brain to play in, of, like, what might happen.
Yes. And that's what's exciting. And that's where fantasy can spice up a sex life. Again, even if you don't ever act on it, but to just share, like when couples just share the thing that they think about or are curious about, or wonder about, or get excited about.
But Kristin, it's scary.
It's scary
to share that stuff.
Yeah. Why is it scary for you?
I mean, we talked about it at the beginning of the episode. It's scary because you think that, like, you might be judged by your partner, or, like, what if you say something and they're like, no. Right. Or, like, what if you share something and maybe you're just, like, not ready to take action? Like, or maybe there's, like, shame, embarrassment about it. Like, if I tell you this, you might think I'm weird.
And when you say too that it's hard enough for people to talk about sex, let alone fantasy.
Yeah.
And talking about, so when we talk about wanting, so fantasy is a wanting, and that's super vulnerable to want and to share what you want. Oftentimes it's easier for people to say what they don't want. Right. Like, what's your fantasy? Well, I don't know, but I can tell you what I don't want.
Oh yeah. I had a conversation with a client this week, and I asked her point blank, if you could have it all your way, if you could have your marriage all your way, what would it look like? What would you want? And she couldn't say anything. All she could say was what she didn't want.
Yeah.
I don't want my husband to do this, and I want him to stop doing this, or I want my life to change this way. Like, I want my kids to stop this, or I want to have this stress go away. But I'm like, no, but what do you want?
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's hard for people.
So do you remember that one scene from The Notebook? It's one of my favorite clips about the wanting
Probably
and
not.
Fantasy.
What?
Come on,
want?
Nate. Yeah, that is what it is.
Yeah? Okay.
Where he goes over, the main character, and asks, like, what do you want? And she's like,
the sexy Ryan Gosling with his ripped abs.
So good. So good. And asks, what do you want? And she's like, I don't know. And what do you want? And finally he's like, what do you want? And she never can articulate it. And part of fantasy
and
is
every woman around the world
is
like, that's me. I don't know what I want either.
Yeah. Yeah. So being able to
not every woman, every Nicholas Sparks woman.
And to know what you want, you know, and the wanting, that's part of fantasy. So in terms of the scariness, the wanting and sharing and having that be held is scary.
Yeah, that is scary. So why should we do it then if it's scary?
That's the piece of when I work with couples where they at times are like, help us spice up our sex life, but keep this as comfortable as possible. Like, we don't want to change anything and we don't want to risk, but help us have a better sex life.
We want something different, but we don't want to have to do anything different.
Exactly.
We want a different result, but can you make it so that we don't have to really do that much different behaviorally?
Yeah. And Dr. Tammy Nelson, I love how she phrases it, that couples get stuck in the sweatpants phase of a relationship where they're super comfortable, but it's not exciting. And relationships or sex lives can get stuck in a rut like that, the sweatpants phase. So
it sounds like you kind of have to flirt with this like growth edge. Like there's this edge of comfort where you hit the edge, and then once you have, like, in order to grow, you have to step over the comfortable edge and push outside into this unknown territory that you've never been in before. And that's where the growth takes place. That's where the growth as a couple. That's where the growth in the quality of your sex life and your emotional and physical intimacy happens. But it doesn't happen unless you kind of push on that edge.
And finding what your growth edge is. I like to help people find the place that pushes them and challenges them and moves them out of their comfort zone. But it's not so far that it shuts them down.
Right. You're not like leaping over the edge. You're just kind of like pushing on it a little bit.
And that's where I say, starting with putting your toe in the water. That's a good place to start. You may not, like, if you take this conversation, like, I'm going to share it all.
Yeah.
I don't know if I would, you can, but that may push you to the point where you shut down, because that's totally past your growth edge.
Totally.
And so that growth edge, if we push that is how we grow in our relationship and keep the spark and the excitement and that erotic connection alive beyond just roommates. Like, we can get into roommate sex where, again, it's just predictable. It's fine. We're doing it every Sunday morning before we make eggs. But it's fine. And then I might get sick of eggs because I'm like, ugh.
Right. So then you make it every Sunday morning before waffles.
Right. Spice that up and add some bacon.
A little bit of bacon spices anything up. Great. So let's talk a little bit about this. Now that we talked about the growth edge, this place where if you want a little bit to get out of the sweatpants, you have to push against the growth edge. What are some easy ways? Like, what's a way to dip your toe in the water? How do you start a conversation like that?
One of the safest places is to set up, like, I call the difference between kind of scripted conversations or freestyle. And sometimes freestyle is too far for people. Yeah. Like they are not practiced at it. And that can be a skill, like a practice skill, like anything else.
Right.
And so sometimes having scripted prompts where it's like, I'm just going to go off of this, and here's a few prompts that I would love for us to explore together. And here's going to be my job. I'm going to share an answer to this question, and your job is just to listen. Like, I don't even need you to respond other than to hear it.
Right.
Like, you don't need to judge it. You don't need to solve it. You don't need to say, so we're going to do this. Like, want you to hear it.
I have eye boogers.
Oh,
sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah. So going off a script.
And
awesome idea.
I need to say to those people that are like, that sounds super canned. Well, I say, well, how are your other strategies working for you? And so it's better than nothing, and it's a start.
It's okay. That comment rubs me the wrong way.
Okay.
Because I feel like in every other area of your life where you want to grow, you start with the basics.
Yep.
Like, I guarantee you the best piano players in the world still do scales. And when they're warming up, they'd go do their scales, because that's how you warm up. That's how you get started.
And you're a dancer. You're a fantastic swing dancer from
Yeah.
what I saw at your wedding.
Revealed.
Did you just
secrets out now.
Did you start off being able to just
you can't improvise when you start. You learn the basic steps
and the fundamentals.
You learn the fundamentals, and then you practice the fundamentals over and over and over again. And there's some people who've danced for decades, and they still like go to courses to practice their swing out, the very fundamental move.
Might inspire you? Like, if you see someone swing dancing, you're like, I want to do that.
Right.
But you're not starting there. You're starting with the basics.
Yeah.
If you are wanting a passionate, exciting sex life,
you start with the basics.
You're starting with the basics and building.
One of my favorite, like Kobe Bryant. There's a story about him when he played for the Olympic team, and he would wake up at like 5 a.m. and go down to the gym before anybody else was even awake. And he would try and get 200 layups and free throws. Like, he would just go, just free throw. And he wouldn't stop until he got 200 of them made.
Yeah.
And it's like, how many free throws has this dude shot in his life? but he still practices his free throws. He starts with the basics. So starting with the script, starting with the foundation, like I think it's a lame excuse if you think it's inauthentic, because it's a framework that will help you develop the skills to be able to improv it down the line.
Absolutely. And you can pull in the art, but for now, you're starting with the basics.
Stick with the basics.
Yeah. So we came up in what we were talking about a little, one of the ways, and this doesn't just apply to talking about fantasy, but sex in general, right? Is always starting with an appreciation.
Yeah.
Again, it makes someone so much more open to hear. Because if you start off with a fantasy as kind of an attack or a bullet of what I wish you really were doing is this. That's not a great way to share your fantasy.
Give feedback.
So it's starting with one thing I appreciate about you is I love how you rub my hair. Then all your job is to say, so you like it when I rub my hair? That's it. You're just responding and parroting it back.
Or the last time we had sex, one thing I really loved was like how you just were assertive and you went for what you wanted.
I loved that about you.
Or I loved that you initiated last time. It made me feel desired. Thank you.
And one thing I am curious about is having my hair pulled. And my face would probably be like, like, what do you think?
Can we try it?
But I don't. And the reason why I use what I'm curious about is it's not, I'm ready and wanting to try this.
Right.
I just want to share what's been going on in my erotic mind, because we all sometimes have these erotic minds that's really scary to share.
Yeah.
And so just being able to, again, this little tiny prompt of one thing I'm curious about, one thing I think about, what's been on my mind is, and these kind of little fill in the blank prompts, you can honestly, if you don't even want to do conversation, sexting fantasies can be super fun.
That might be a little easier because you're not like face to face.
That could be again a stepping place. Yeah. Writing little erotic notes. These are all other ways you can communicate that fantasy piece, but starting with these little prompts.
Yes.
And with the expectation, you can start off the prompt of, I don't even know what I think about this yet. I don't know if I want to act it out, but I want to share.
My brain a little bit.
This is something what I think.
So what I appreciate about you, something I'm curious about is, how about one thing that I want more of is?
Yes, that can be a good one because I love what you're doing with this and I want more
of it.
So I'm going to give the example that most women say that right when they're starting the clitoral stimulation that they want, then men move off of it and stop because they start to see that there's response and there's excitement. And so then,
and I think it might be a difference between how men and women oftentimes experience arousal. Like with men, when something feels good, sometimes speeding up and adding pressure or going harder and faster is a good thing.
That can be with clitoral stimulation too.
Okay.
But they'll move off of stimulating the clitoris and move to like penetration or
something else.
Right.
They're
and
like,
so,
all right, we're hitting the hot button. Time to move on.
Yeah, exactly. So being able to say, I want more of this. I want more kissing. I want more conversation. But again, fantasy can be a wonderful tool or a weapon depending on how you use it. And I encourage you to make it a tool so that it doesn't get into a point of conflict and that you shut that part of your life down. Historically, if you have if you've been hurt with that, you may need to do some repair work of, I have shared this and it was actually really painful and I will never do that with that person again. It's worth doing some repair work around that.
That makes sense.
And to talk about about the hurt.
Awesome. I think those are some good templates to start with.
Yeah.
To start the conversation.
Hopefully.
Well, can we summarize kind of everything that we talked about?
Let's do that.
So we initially talked about how fantasies can be scary for people.
Super vulnerable. And I would also say scary, unknown charted territory. Like
it's always scary.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that. This is the second time I've referenced this week, but do you remember Indiana Jones where there's that one scene? I think it's I almost said Goblet of Fire, but that's Harry Potter. Indiana Jones is it the Temple of Doom? Where he goes and he has that cliff and it has a sheer drop off. And then he has to take the step into the unknown.
Yep.
And that first step is the scary step. And then the path kind of starts to open up a little bit.
And with that, I'd say
the leap of faith.
The leap of faith could also just be, I want to share a fantasy. What do you think about that? Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I want to
okay.
share a fantasy. What do you think about that? And you're not even sharing the fantasy. You're just sharing that you want to share a fantasy, or I'm curious what your fantasies are.
Yep.
You can just start with that.
And then we talked about that fantasies don't necessarily have to be like big and elaborate. They can be something as simple as somebody coming home and taking out the garbage, or giving you a foot massage, or helping you with chores around the house, or just being more assertive. So it doesn't have to be like scandalous to be a fantasy. It can be actually something really kind of approachable.
It's anything that stirs us and connects us and arouses us, but we have to broaden what that means.
Then we talked about the 3 kinds of fantasy. There's novel fantasy, or forbidden. Then there's like scenes of being irresistible, or seductive. And then there's the dominance and submission, which is like having somebody be more assertive or less assertive. We talked about what else? That it's important to the reason it's important to talk about fantasy is because it pushes your growth edge. And even though you might have an adequate sex life, this can be a way for you to get out of the sweatpants phase and get out of like the habitual same sex every single time that you get together. That can get kind of boring and redundant. And
it can deepen your erotic connection. Again, to know each other's inner world. That alone can deepen the connection.
You mentioned that the brain is the biggest sex organ. Is it worth noting that some people can experience orgasm without even being touched?
Totally it is, because it's called thinking off.
Thinking off?
That the fantasy can be so strong that you can orgasm without even physical touch.
That's impressive.
Yeah, totally.
A skill that's worth acquiring.
Yeah.
And then we talked about a couple of different templates that you can use to start kind of playing around with talking about fantasies if this is something that is outside your comfort zone. So using things like one thing I'm curious about, one thing I appreciate about you is, one thing I'd love to have more of, one thing I'd love to have like less of. I don't think is necessarily fantasy talk, but what do I want more of? And this is all like owning what you want, your own desire, which is a very vulnerable thing for a lot of people.
And I think that's one of the takeaways is we talked about like, what do you want for your fantasy? But it may even start even back a little bit of what do I want? What do I want more of? And doing that with yourself of what do I want? Like if I could have anything in the bedroom, if I could have anything, maybe not in the bedroom, if I could have anything in the car, and you're like, oh, I actually don't want it in the bedroom. I want it in the car.
Right.
But if you could have whatever you wanted, what would that be? And that can be an even starting point. If you haven't connected with the word fantasy yet, what do I want?
What do I want? That's a great.
If I could have whatever I wanted.
Okay, so that's a great takeaway. Get clear what you want. Start having the conversation, and be willing to push your growth edge. Those are, I think, the best 3 takeaways from this episode that you can take. You who are listening right now and watching right now, you can take those 3 tips and start tonight.
Absolutely.
Improve your relationship.
Think about what you want.
Yep.
Okay.
And then ask for it.
That's right.
Cool. We'll be doing this again next week. Next Tuesday. Same time, same place.
That's right.
If you want to tune in, I guess a couple of things. You can look in the description of this episode to get links to how to contact both Kristin and me. And we also have some gifts for you. Kristin has an awesome ebook that you can download about how to talk to your kids about sex. You'll find a link for that in the description. And then I've got an ebook as well that I'm giving away that are 100 promises that you can make to your partner right now that'll improve your relationship. And
I think it's worth mentioning that we're on iTunes if you want to listen to us and subscribe. Can
Go back and listen to the old
plug
episode.
That we moved to number 64?
On Stitcher's,
and that we're the fastest growing
podcast. Yeah, we have our podcast is one of the fastest growing podcasts on
it's exciting.
The web right
That's
now.
Super exciting. So you can watch us here and listen here, but you also can get it later and listen in your ears.
Or go back and listen to past episodes.
Right.
So subscribe to the Loveumentary. And then is there anything that you want to plug?
I don't think so. I think you've done a great job.
Great.
Thanks to Today's Mama always for hosting us. It's an amazing space to be able to share. Thank you so much.
And I guess we'll see you next week then.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.